you can't understand this movement without understanding that there's a link between the origins of the movement in defense of racism, the embrace of Ronald Reagan in 1980.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, Facebook Live or YouTube or some other place, or as a podcast. And today I'm with Randall Balmer, the John Phillips Professor in Religion at Dartmouth College. Randall is a friend of mine. We share a lot of interests, have written on similar topics, lived similar topics and journeys. I'm looking at a new book of Randall's called Bad Faith, which we will be talking about today, that I wrote a little blurb for, what's called a blurb, a sort of a recommendation, and we'll talk about that. I was just telling Randall, it's hard to remember when you've read a book in manuscript form to endorse it some months before, and then the actual book shows up. You got to sort of check and make sure it's the same one, especially sometimes titles change. But Randall, let me first thank you for being with us today. And then just bring up a little personal note. After the whole COVID thing and everything, I've so lost track of time. I remember it seems like yesterday you and I had lunch together.
Yeah, we did.
To talk about things. But when was that? Do you remember?
It was probably a couple of years ago.
I know, but doesn't it seem sort of like, everything, the social stuff stopped. So, you're probably one of the last people I had lunch with before it all hell broke loose.
I think that's right. It was kind of descending at the time.
I know, but we weren't masked up yet. And I think I even shook your hand.
We did. Yes, that's right. I think that's right. And we had a wonderful conversation. Could have gone all day.
We did. And you're up in Dartmouth and I'm in northern Massachusetts. So that's a couple hours drive from where you're at. And you were on your way to Boston and then very kindly stopped and had lunch with me. Yeah. And I think we talked about what you were working on, which is this book, Bad Faith. I want to let folks know what I said about it, since this is my little talk show here, and then we'll get into the content of the book. I put it this way: anyone who wants to find the way back from the evangelical Republican suicide pact of the Trump years needs to read this book. And that's Bad Faith by Randall Balmer. You're watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer or listening on the podcast. And once again, Randall is a professor at Dartmouth College. Now, where you and I sort of converge on a lot of content is that you have made a study of the rise of the religious right, in particular looking at the influence of the anti-abortion movement. And of course, my family, me having been the nepotistic sidekick of Francis Schaeffer, was part of that movement. Right. I left the whole evangelical movement a long time ago. What first led you to study this bit of American history in such depth that produced this book, but also many other things you've written and talked about? What got you into this?
Well, it's I grew up, you and I have very similar backgrounds. My father wasn't nearly so famous as your father, of course, but my father was a minister for 40 years in the Evangelical Free Church. So I grew up in that world. And in the 1970s in particular, I was a student at Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois, and then at Trinity Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. I was actually working full-time in the development department at Trinity Seminary, and then doing part-time a degree in church history at the same time. My point in mentioning this is to say that for the bulk of the 1970s, for really all of the 1970s, I was embedded in what I call the evangelical subculture. That is this vast and interlocking network of congregations, denominations, publishing houses, missionary society, Bible camps, Christian colleges, and so forth. And I was right there. And I was very much aware that evangelicals were starting to get interested in politics, in part because of Jimmy Carter, actually, because Jimmy Carter was talking unabashedly about being a born-again Christian. And we were always kind of sheepish about using that terminology to describe ourselves. And so it got our attention. And then as evangelicals began to move into politics toward the late part of the 1970s, I was there saying, wait a minute, why are you moving toward Ronald Reagan of all people? As you know, a divorced and remarried former Hollywood actor. Hollywood's not exactly known as a province of piety for evangelicals. And so I was trying to figure that out. And then to be honest, I sort of discarded the whole question. I went off to graduate school in 1980, and my graduate work really is in colonial history, colonial religious history. And so I wasn't much interested in that until my first job. I'll try to make this answer more compact because I'm getting a lot of stuff here. I apologize for that. My first job for 27 years actually was at Columbia University. And in the late 1980s, as you will remember very well, is when all the Televangelist scandals broke with Jim
just
Baker.
to go back to Columbia, what was your focus at Columbia? What were you doing there?
Well, I was hired there. I was an assistant professor beginning in 1985.
And what were you teaching?
I was teaching courses, Survey of Religion in America, which is really my kind of broad field.
It's your thing, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know, but Puritanism and I don't know, all sorts of stuff.
So did you do little projects on John and Abigail Adams and that kind of thing, or were you more less specific?
At that time, no, I wasn't. I kind of got interested in the church-state issue a little bit later, but so. No, not really.
Yeah.
So, and in my field, I defined myself at that time as a colonial historian, not as a historian of evangelicalism, even though I knew that world very well.
Yeah.
And then when the televangelist scandals broke, I was really the only expert in New York City. I mean, that sounds grandiose to say that.
No, I totally get it. I totally get it.
Because nobody else, I mean, people in New York had no idea what an evangelical was.
They'd never met one. I'm gonna do a little parentheses there just to get you to chuckle a moment. My wife and I often joke about the fact, because we spend a lot of time in New York, and we have a little saying we go back and forth, because I remember my father in Liberty Fellowship in the 70s and 80s, there would be students from New York or from Columbia, whatever, who would come. Sure. And they would become Christians, i.e. they accepted Jesus.
Right.
And then they would ask, now, what church should we go to when we go back to New York City? And Dad's stock answer was, there are no good churches in New York. So you can tuck that one away for your next book.
I like that. I like that. I like that.
That was our view of you guys.
Oh, sure. Well, you know, I mean,
good churches.
When Billy Graham visited New York in 1957 for his famous Madison Square Garden campaign, he explicitly identified New York City with Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's great. I mean, New York has been our whipping boy for a long time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you're there, and there are no evangelicals or good churches, but there's Randall Balmer. Now, at that point, would you have described yourself personally in your Columbia years in terms of your faith? If an evangelical had come to you and said, do you know Christ is your personal savior, and the lingo, where would you have placed yourself? Where were you in your journey during those years, or how did that all play out before we get to Dartmouth and your more
I would absolutely have used that language to describe myself. That's how I
throughout the whole time in Columbia.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. And
speaking of which, where did you go to church, if any?
I didn't much, to be honest.
You didn't much. Okay.
Although by that time I was on my way toward the Episcopal Church. And which I had kind of stumbled into in graduate school. And you know, as you probably know, I'm now an Episcopal priest, so that was kind of the beginning of that journey.
Yes.
So I went to Episcopal churches more than any others at that time.
Yeah. Okay, so you're in Columbia, you're Episcopal, you're a Christian, you're teaching colonial history, church state. Okay, so then at that point, was there any time in that era, because we showed up at Madison Square Gardens too in the late 70s with our film series.
Right.
Were you ever aware of anybody called Francis Schaeffer in your kind of passage? I'm not saying you should have been. I'm just wondering, did you trip over any of us or any of my dad's followers?
Oh, no, of course I did. Oh, yes, absolutely. No, I began learning about Francis Schaeffer when I was in college at Trinity College. And
okay, so you go back.
Yeah, so I knew very well who he was.
And you were aware of the, quote, stands we were taking on the various social issues and so forth?
I did. I mean, while I was in graduate school, I kind of shifted away from evangelicalism, not out of rebellion, but I wasn't interested in the inerrancy debates and things like
Right.
that any longer. I mean,
Yeah.
although I have to confess, I wrote my MA thesis at Trinity about inerrancy. So
So you knew the lingo
I
anyway.
knew that world, I knew that terrain very well.
And what did you say, by the way, in that era? Just take a second
Well,
and tell me where you came down on it there.
Well, I took a historical approach, and so what I tried to argue, really at the behest of my advisor John Woodbridge, was that the so-called the inspiration article of 1881 by A.A. Hodge and B.B. Warfield
Yeah.
really was not the first articulation of the doctrine of inerrancy.
Yeah.
Looking back, I'm not sure I could probably maybe stand by that argument entirely any longer, but that was my contribution to that. And I had several articles published out of that. So that's
Warfield was one of the names that, most 7-year-olds don't know, but I grew up hearing all about him because he was the hero of my dad's.
I bet you did.
I mean, who else heard of the Schofield Bible or Warfield or any of these people?
That's right.
Gretchen Machen,
Oh, sure, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so that was the terrain. Now, you went from Columbia up to Dartmouth, and where in that passage do we start the beginning of Bad Faith, this terrific little book that's come out at a very appropriate moment, post-storming of the Capitol, et cetera. I mean, where does that story for you begin with you looking into this stuff?
Well, what happened, it was actually back at Columbia, and the real moment was my first book was on colonial religious history, and then my second book was on kind of popular evangelicalism, the travelogue book, where I traveled all over the country and visited.
What were the titles of those two books?
Well, the first book is called A Perfect Babble of Confusion. It's about the colonial New York and New Jersey. But the second book was called Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture in America. And that was the book we made into a 3-part PBS series. And
that one I knew about.
Yeah, right. Right.
And was tracking with. So, okay. So that, and when was that, by the way?
That we did the book came out in 1989, and then we did the documentary in the early 90s.
Okay.
We did the filming on that. So, and you as a filmmaker would shake your head if you knew what the budget was for that production. But we did it. We pulled it off, and it was. So that book got me invited to a small gathering in Washington, D.C. in November 1990.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I remember being puzzled. Why am I being invited for this? Because this was a gathering ostensibly to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of Ronald Reagan's election to the presidency. Well, I hadn't been celebrating 10 years earlier.
Right.
And I wasn't about to celebrate 10 years later. But I found myself in a room, a small conference room, maybe 30 people, with Richard Viguerie, this direct mail conservative guru, Ed Dobson, who was one of Jerry Falwell's surrogates at Moral Majority. I'm sure you met him in the course of your travels. Donald Wildman, head of the American Family Association. Ralph Reed, executive director of the Christian Coalition.
Yeah.
And Paul Weyrich, who's, as you know, is really the architect of the religious right. So here I am in this room with all these people. Richard Land was there. It's a who's who of the religious right.
Yeah.
And in the course of the first gathering, Paul Weyrich, who actually put this all together in the late 1970s, said, let's be clear about this. The religious right did not get started in opposition to abortion, it had nothing to do with abortion in its early years. And he was just emphatic about that. And after that session, there was a break, and I went up to him and I said, I want to make sure I understood you correctly. He said, absolutely not. He said, I've been trying since the Goldwater campaign to get these people interested in politics, because he recognized the electoral power of that huge population. He said, I tried the abortion issue, I tried the pornography issue, I tried the women's rights issue, I tried the school prayer issue. Nothing got their interest until the IRS in the 1970s began to try to revoke the tax-exempt status of these segregation academies and
white academies,
exactly.
quote unquote Christian school movement.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just emphatic about this. So, and that, Frank, kind of got me started on this decades-long odyssey to find out what the real origins of this movement
What
are.
year was that? Do you remember when you were all sitting in that room, what year that was?
November 1990.
Because Ralph was a young guy at that point.
Oh, he was, absolutely, yeah.
Because I know everybody you mentioned who was in the room there,
Sure.
and all the rest of the guys. Now, Weyrich was sort of the father of the whole direct mail thing for a while.
Well, or Viggory was more.
Viggory, I mean, and then Weyrich. But I'm trying to remember. I know you know. It's in your book, but were they both Roman Catholic, or were they?
Weyrich had been Roman Catholic, and then he went really, really far to the right. Some really fringe Greek Melkite or something.
I remember. That's it.
Yeah,
Melkites.
Really,
yes,
yeah.
yes. I knew it was something. That's why I was asking you.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So there was him, and then I'm trying to remember, because back at about the time you were there, a little before that, I was hanging out with Rousseff Rushdoony.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
And Gary North, his son-in-law, who then had a falling out because Gary North felt Rushdoony wasn't going far enough to the right.
Right.
Like he was pro-slavery, but there were things, he wasn't, I mean, it boggles the mind. What I can't remember is the connection with Rushdoony and some of the guys you were talking to in that room. They knew who he was, and he was very supportive of their agenda. But do you remember anybody ever in that context or in years later finding any sort of connection between the Reconstructionist theonomist folks and these guys?
Oh, I think there was. I think, and you probably know this as well as I do, but they certainly adopted, in terms of their agenda, they certainly adopted a lot of his ideas. It's sort of dominionist theology, as it's called. It's called many things, as you know, but dominionism was one of them. And I can't testify to the extent to which they had personal interrelationships with him, but they were certainly drawing on his ideas. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah, I mean, it bears mentioning here, and I know you and I have already talked about this, but I'm going to bring it into this conversation just because I think folks who are watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, with Randall Balmer, the John Phillips Professor of Religion at Dartmouth College, who's written this book, Bad Faith, that I highly recommend, should know that when my dad and I sat down with Reverend Billy Graham, the evangelist, he at that point in the late 1970s said he was pro-choice. Now, he didn't use those words because that phraseology hadn't been coined, but literally said, Francis, I'm not going to be able to join you on this one, because they had already signed things together, for instance, in Lausanne at a big congress that they did on evangelism and world evangelical affairs and so forth. They had been very close on a lot of things. He said, I can't join you on this one, Francis. I learned my lesson with Nixon. I'm not going there again. And I don't think I can preach the love of Jesus to women who we stand in judgment of for something that men would do if they got pregnant. And that is more or less what he said word for word. And I was in the room. I'll tell you exactly where we were. We were in Methodist Hospital across from St. Mary's, where Dad was going for chemo. And we crossed the street to go see Billy, who was staying overnight for one of those Mayo Clinic extensive health checks that takes a couple days.
Right.
We made the case to him. Ruth Graham, his wife, joined my mother on a board of an early crisis pregnancy center. That was as far as they would go. We made the same pitch in Dallas, had made the same pitch in Dallas to Dr. Criswell, who at that time was president of the Southern Baptist Convention. He was also the pastor of First Baptist in Dallas. He was also the president of Dallas Theological Seminary. And as I don't have to explain to you, but for people watching this, that is as conservative as you can get in America on any religious front. That's it. I mean, that's the whole thing. He was pro-choice, and he went so far as to roll out Bible verses that he felt spoke to the issue, such as the one where it says that if by an accident you cause a woman to miscarry, you pay a fine, but if she dies in the accident, you pay the price for murder.
Right.
Okay, so he had a whole theology of pro-choice, not just ambivalence, but pro-choice. It should be legal. I mention that only because I don't think that when you and I talk about this issue, I think in both the secular
arena of the media and the evangelical arena, there's a sort of idea that somehow evangelicals have always been part of this thing. They haven't. And so we were there and part of that transition. But I think that a really major point that needs to be made repeatedly, because it's so far away from where people's thinking is on this, is what I've just said. And it isn't just those two guys. We had to take on the editorial board of Christianity Today magazine that refused to even review the book and or the movie series, having done nothing but paid homage to my dad's work for 10 years before that.
Right. Exactly.
So I don't think folks understand how out of character it was for evangelicals to get into the anti-abortion movement. So I just want you now to, I've talked too much. This is your interview.
No.
Will you please jump in here and do some stuff for us?
No, I'll just reinforce what you just said. Not only did Criswell, as you say, develop a pro-choice theology, when the Roe v. Wade ruling was handed down, he issued a statement applauding the Roe v. Wade decision. And 2 years before, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion, which they reaffirmed in 1974, the year after Roe v. Wade, and again in 1976. I mean, I've got, this is, and I'll even, if you'll give me a second, I'll find a quote.
Please do.
James Dobson on this, which I have to say was surprising to me as I began to do research for this book. James Dobson, when the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down, and of course we're talking about somebody who became an implacable foe of abortion, he said that the Bible was silent on the matter, therefore it was plausible for an evangelical to believe that, quote, a developing embryo or fetus was not regarded as a full human being. This is James Dobson.
This is Dobson.
Right. So I mean, I can pile on evidence here, but the larger point, and you know this very well because you were in the trenches, the larger point is that the anti-abortion issue was a Catholic issue in the 1970s. Yes. Evangelicals were not interested. In fact, actually, the other thing I discovered in the course of writing the book, as far as I could tell, the first evangelical to come out against abortion was Senator Mark Hatfield, Republican of Oregon, evangelical Baptist. In 1973, he introduced legislation to make abortion illegal. As far as I can tell, he's the first public person.
Yeah, and when Dr. C. Everett Koop, who becomes Ronald Reagan Surgeon General, came to L'Abri because he had known Dad back in the late 30s and early 40s in the States. Since 40, I think it was 1940 something, they had known each other. He came to L'Abri. He was so pleased we had included abortion as an example in the first film series, How Should We Then Live, in the last episode, of what my father called judicial overreach or judicial fiat. It was a good example for a point he was making, but the reason he used abortion to make the point was because Koop was like a number of Roman Catholics, although Koop was a very reformed Calvinist. He had been an ardent anti-abortion activist back in the very, very early days, long before Roe. He sort of focused our attention on that. And then, of course, later we developed a whole film series. But again, to go back to this point, what folks don't realize is that our Schaeffer, the Schaeffer evangelical juggernaut, pro-life, everything, our battle was not with the, quote, secularists and National Organization of Women or Planned Parenthood or whoever. We were fighting other evangelicals for 3 years to even get them to even modestly get involved with us. And we lost a lot of money because we went out thinking they would show up the way they had for my dad's other events for How Should We Then Live, his thing on art and culture. They didn't. We were playing to empty arenas where we had filled them completely 4 or 5 years before. And his popularity had not fallen off. It was the issue. They did not want any part of this.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, that you mentioned that when we had our lunch together, and that to me was a revelation, because I thought that the second series was immensely popular, but
it was eventually after we
foundational.
And that took years to turn it around, but it never succeeded in the seminar phase until we made the news a couple of times because the National Organization of Women had sent some people out to picket us, and that got picked up somewhere, and gradually it sort of picked up. And the other reason it began to make news is because we managed to get some folks like Falwell and others involved. And then, of course, people like Weyrich and Viggory began to tell Roman Catholics
Right.
who were already involved in the anti-abortion crusade on a different level to show up, as in like, hey, the Protestant cavalry just came over the hill and their own people aren't helping them. So, you show up. And so we began, my dad had to change his theology from that he had held on the inerrancy of scripture and how you really get saved. I can remember as a child, we had missions to Italy and France and other places, and we had Bible studies there to try to get these lost Roman Catholics saved. They weren't even Christians. I was raised thinking Roman Catholics, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, were all in the same category. They're lost.
Yep.
Okay, so gradually Dad started saying, well, maybe they're not all lost because the only people who are buying tickets to our venue here are Roman Catholics. So we softened our position.
That's amazing.
Because they bailed us out.
That's right.
And who started all that was Fulton Sheen in New York, the Archbishop.
I remember that from your book.
He invited me to his place. And after that, and I remember kneeling next to him on a little velvet cushion. He had his own little private chapel in there, and we prayed on it. And of course, it was different. I'd been raised thinking, even if you make the sign of the cross, this sort of sign of the devil from a fundamentalist point of view, you don't do all this outward stuff. Here I am kneeling next to Fulton Sheen as a teenager, or maybe young 20, while he thanks God in a long, flowery prayer for the fact that, at last God has moved the heart of these Protestant friends to stand up with the church and so forth. And it's like, okay. And then when we made our film series, The Godfather had been filming in a cemetery in New York, that huge one that you drive in when you come from the airports. You go through all these tombstones, and we wanted to film there. We had a scene with Schaeffer Coop there in the film, in Whatever Happened to Human Race, and we were denied permission instantly. So I called Fulton Sheen up, and he made one call, and we were in.
That's a great story.
It paid off.
That's a great story.
But it was very bewildering for me because I had been raised believing all Roman Catholics were lost.
Sure.
Now the only people who will help us on the issue in the early days were Roman Catholics. Besides which, all of a sudden they're the only people coming to our events at the beginning, and Dad now all of a sudden is saying he'll be in St. Mary's Hospital in Rochester, Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic, which is Roman Catholic, and not at the Methodist Hospital where Billy Graham's going, because those guys do abortions.
Oh, right.
I mean, it got really loopy.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. And I think the question underlying this conversation, and what I try to get at the book, is, well, if it wasn't abortion, what was it?
Yeah.
And that leads us into the whole weeds of race and racism. And
yes.
And I have to say, Frank, I've spent much of my career defending evangelicals against the charge of racism. And in the course of writing this book, and particularly in the wake of the 2016 election, I can't do it anymore.
Yeah,
it to me, the book allowed me to connect the dots, to draw the lines between these different things. And what got this movement going, what got Jerry Falwell's attention, was the IRS going after his tax exemption because he had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Yeah.
And the Bob Jones case, that it just begins to snowball. That's what got them interested. And again, Weyrich and others. I mean, I quote many others in the book, but that is what got them motivated to become involved in politics in an organized way. And they weren't before that. And again, you know that as well as I.
Sure.
In the middle decades of the 20th century, evangelicals maybe were registered to vote, maybe, but certainly not in any organized way. And
well, I grew up hearing from my father in the early iteration of Francis Schaeffer that our business was bringing people to the Lord.
Exactly.
And politics wasn't something we were supposed to even think about.
That's right. It was dirty. It was
dirty. You didn't touch
worldly.
Yeah. I'm going to go back. I'm with Randall Balmer, who's got this book, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. It's a slim, lovely hardcover volume. You really need to buy this book and read it if you have any interest whatsoever in the journey of the evangelical right wing
that eventually gave us Trump. This is one of the missing puzzle pieces. You've got to read it. Sort of as a footnote to what we were just talking about, and then I'm going to move on. I've got a question from Linda here. Can you comment on the religious right's acceptance of George Wallace's candidacy? I remember as a teenager going to religious right political meetings and becoming appalled at the evangelicals considering Wallace for president. So that, of course, what year would have that been?
68.
Yeah, so 68. So if you jump back to that, obviously there are things already going on.
Right. Yeah, right. But again, not in an organized way, the way that evangelicals turned out for the 1980 election.
No, nothing even touching that.
No.
And a lot of evangelicals would have looked at that askance, not so much on the basis of who Wallace was, but why are you involved in politics at all?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know,
yeah, right, yeah.
I mean, my father would go around railing against the quote apathy of the evangelicals because they don't vote and they're not. Okay, so just to turn the page here a little bit again, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you're listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And I'm talking with Randall Balmer, who is the author of Bad Faith, the book we're discussing today, and I urge you to get. I find that your book fills in a piece in the same way we were talking a few moments ago about something people don't understand much about, and that is that evangelicals were not quote, always in the pro-life movement. And footnote, they've now adopted more of that because with people like Hobby Lobby, they're suing to not provide contraceptive coverage now. Yeah. So, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, you know, I mean, talking about Roman Catholic issues, we just, it doesn't seem to end. But I think that a lot of folks don't understand that the really hardcore manipulative core players that still include people like Ralph Reed today of Weyrich and these other guys knew exactly what they were doing.
Yeah.
And they won.
They won. Yeah.
They won. Yeah. We lost. We being the good-hearted evangelicals who thought we were saving babies, because believe me, at a certain point, I was totally sincere about this. And I have cried mea culpa many times saying later it was greed, access to power, hobnobbing with, you know, Jerry Falwell, borrowing his private jet to fly around, but it didn't begin that way.
Right. No.
It did not begin that way with my father and me.
Right.
And I regret the way I helped push my father, because a son can push a father like nobody else can in a direction that has branded him as a father of the religious right. In one way, you're riding to the rescue here because he became very visible as the evangelical, but there was other stuff going on of far more cynical people. And I want you to talk more about the folks in that room, and I want you to play out what they did to the evangelical movement. And they did it on purpose. Let's just take the gloves off, play it out.
Well, they did. And again, Weyrich is, you know, I sometimes call him the evil genius. I mean, I don't care for his politics by any stretch of the imagination, but he was really deft working behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. What happened is that he got all of these ministers all in a lather over their tax exemptions and their racial policies. And so what I argue in the book is that there's really no other way to look at the religious right than other than as a defense of racism. I mean, you can't sugarcoat it. That's what got that group going. And one further bit of evidence to our earlier part of the conversation, Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February of 1978.
Yes.
That's more than 5 years after Roe v. Wade. It wasn't abortion that got him interested in politics. It was a defense of racial segregation.
Well, and he had been a segregationist.
Of course, yeah, you're right. He talked about the civil rights movement as civil wrongs and things like, absolutely. But Weyrich's genius, and it's a diabolical genius in my judgment, was he was able to shift that conversation away from a defense of racism, and this is going to sound familiar given the current political context, to a defense of religious freedom, right?
Yep.
We should be able to run Bob Jones University as we want to run it because we don't accept any money from the federal government, right? Yeah. How many times did I hear that argument growing up? I mean, not just
again
Bob
and
Jones,
again and on everything. And places like Hillsdale College, whose whole raison d'etre is that.
Exactly. What he fails to point out is something you know very well. Tax exemption is a form of public subsidy.
Yes, it is.
Of course it is. You only have to think about it for 30 seconds, right? Even where I teach, Dartmouth College doesn't pay taxes. Well, that means all of the citizens in Hanover, New Hampshire have to pony up a little bit more to pay for public services that Dartmouth College is not paying for. Now, a lot of these places do voluntarily contribute money. That's another issue. But the point is that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. So the government has every right to come in and say, you cannot discriminate, because it's a violation not only of Brown v. Board of Education, but also the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that's exactly what happened.
So I want to.
But Weyrich was able to shift that to say, "Oh, our religious freedom is under attack." Right? I mean, it's an utterly disingenuous.
And it's continued to be used. And I want to pause and give you two little footnote thoughts, and then have you get into this. Tell us more about who Weyrich is and was, for folks who don't know who he was. Just pretend we've never heard of him. And then after that, draw a line between Weyrich and what he was doing, and Amy Coney Barrett and the new Supreme Court that is basically taking every opportunity to take the Weyrich method to all sorts of issues. And if it's branded as, quote, religious freedom, whether it's the right to meet without masks or vaccines in churches and become super spreader events, oh no, this is about religious freedom. So it's going to be, the whole thing's whitewashed. I'd like you to make that connection, but first, please tell us about Weyrich. Who is this man? How old was he? Where was he born? What is this guy?
Born in Wisconsin, grew up in a conservative Catholic household, and he became a political activist, a conservative, really pretty far right conservative. He's the person that Joseph Coors tapped to become the founder, really, of the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. And then, as we discussed earlier, he thought the Catholic Church was too liberal. And so he moved in a direction, the Greek Melkite Church, and he became something of they have funny titles in that world, as you know, and became some sort of fixture.
Archbishop Lord Wizard.
Something like that, something like that. But again, to recount the conversation that he and I had in November of 1990, he said, I've been trying since the Goldwater campaign to get evangelicals interested in politics, and they tried various things. It wasn't until the race issue came along in the 1970s that they finally became interested in that. But then he was smart enough, and this is, again, part of his genius. He was smart enough to recognize that even in the late 1970s, if he really wanted to mobilize evangelical voters at the grassroots, he needed an issue other than a defense of racial segregation. And so actually what happens is that in the 1978 midterm elections, first of all, he went to the head of the Republican National Committee, who was Bill Brock, former senator from Tennessee. And Weyrich said, I want some money to be able to mobilize evangelical voters. And according to Weyrich, Brock looked at him and said, in effect, who the heck are these people? I'm not going to give you any money. And Weyrich, by his own account, determined to go out and elect some improbable people in that midterm election. So he focuses on 4 Senate races. New Hampshire, Iowa, and then 2 Senate races in Minnesota. One of them is for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale, who, of course, was Carter's vice president. In all 4 of those races, the Democratic nominees were considered to be, shoo-in, odds-on favorites. But in the final weekend of that campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, leafleted church parking lots. And the final Sunday before the campaign, 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 of those favored Democratic candidates lost to pro-life Republicans. I remember going through Weyrich's papers, which are out at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming, of all places, and coming across his correspondence surrounding that election in 1978. It's almost like the papers start to sizzle, because he realizes he's finally got his issue. This is the issue that's going to work for him. And then 3 months later, Frank Schaeffer begins touring the country with whatever happened to the human race. And those two events really kind of dovetail.
And I remember when
the issue.
When I talked to Brock, the first time I met Brock was with Jack Kemp.
And it must have been after the thing you're talking about, because by that time, Kemp and Brock were kind of like, you know, people who had just discovered some new thing, sort of wide-eyed, but it was all, tell us how to do more of this.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
By that point, it was like, oh, no, the discussion over, this works. How do we get more pro-lifers?
Right. Exactly.
And then I was talking to them about the difficulty we're having getting evangelicals to sign up.
Right.
And then it flipped. And it was like, well, one of the things you can tell them is how effective this has been.
Right.
And the penny drops.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden, you know, these issues begin to converge because, hey, we can deal with our tax exempt status if our guys are in Washington.
Absolutely.
We can deal with our bias against women in the workplace if our guys are in Washington. And all of a sudden you begin to see, okay, now somebody flipped the on switch. You know, I just want to say, apropos of nothing, but I want to just talk about bad faith for a minute to people who know my work and my father's work. And I'm talking with Randall Balmer, who's the author of this and teaches at Dartmouth. But Randall, you've done a great thing here besides just writing a really important book. I hate to say a little book. I only say little book because it entices more people to buy it. Yeah, it's not a little book. It's a big book. It's a slim volume, easily read. But you know, I've been hacking away at this issue for a long time with my memoir, Crazy for God, and other things that you know about.
Sure, absolutely.
But you filled in something for me here, and I thought I knew something about this, but you filled in a big blank in the same way that I have helped people realize evangelicals were not always pro-life. Right. Your study of Weyrich, your kind of slam dunk of this manipulative Machiavellian figure of whom Ralph Reed is his true heir now, by the way, in my view. Ralph is the new guy. I mean, a total cynic, an absolute jerk, if I may say so, who from the beginning has been all about, you know, nefarious things. Ralph is really his inheritor, but Weyrich started it all. I don't think I mentioned Weyrich in Crazy for God, my memoir. Somebody who reads my stuff will just think that somehow there were Catholics and then Frank Schaeffer got this idea and pushed his dad into doing a documentary. But, you know, sometimes there really are smoke-filled back rooms where stuff's going on. Yeah. And you pulled the lid off that. So thank you for correcting my own incorrect take on this issue and bringing the knowledge about it to another level, because I have done my best, but I failed to look into one major thing here. And you have filled in a huge piece here that I think is really important. So thank you, because I didn't know enough about this. And I knew these guys, here's the crazy thing, but I had not connected the dots in the way you did. I think this is a tremendous service to history. So thank you. Yeah, just wanted to get that said.
Well, and let me return the compliment, and I don't mean this in a fatuous way at all, because Crazy for God many times pointed me in the right direction. So, and I've used it in my courses here at Dartmouth. So it's a really good book. It's a very important book.
Well, hey, maybe we should do the next one. If I make it into my 90s, I think in my old age, right now I'm doing yard work, but you live up the road, you know, we'll say, let's do one more.
Absolutely.
You know what, I want to point out that you mentioned the heritage.
Yeah.
And the fact that Weyrich was involved in some way with
oh, he's really
Coors,
the founder, really.
Because
founder,
Coors, you know, wrote us a big check for whatever happened to the human race.
Right, yeah.
And
no qualms about taking beer money.
No, we had, yeah. Hey, we thought Catholics were going to hell. A, B, we were teetotalers. But you know, when he wrote us a check for $100,000 or something to do God's work, it was like all of a sudden these Catholics aren't so bad, and actually beer's not alcohol.
I love talking to you, Frank.
Beer has no alcohol. But you know, the funny thing is, out of heritage and also some of my father's work came the Federalist Society.
Yeah, right. Oh,
And the
boy.
Federalist folks took the Weyrich program on religious civil liberties, and they literally groomed people like Amy Coney Barrett for 30,
Yeah.
40 years.
They did.
And people like Michelle Bachmann, who met us at, I think it was Oral Roberts University, where she was, and she read my dad's book, A Christian Manifesto, and told the New Yorker years later that she got into politics because of it. And then they called, I know about this because they called me for a quote on that. But in any case, when you look at the Weyrich, Coors, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalists, these guys played a long game.
They did.
And they won, because then Ralph Reed could go to Trump with a list and say, we'll give you a ground game when you don't have one, because Hillary's a professional and you're not. We've got a ground game. It's called evangelical churches and pro-life centers. Use ours. We'll go door to door for you.
Yeah. Right.
So
Yeah.
do you want to just talk a little bit about Heritage, Amy Coney, the Supreme Court,
Yeah.
religious liberty, and how this agenda has now played out in real time, right this second, right now?
It has, and I think the connecting thread is what I call the rhetoric of victimization, right? Oh, we're under attack. You know, it's our views, our position is under attack. Failing to acknowledge, first of all, the sheer numbers of the movement, for one thing, but secondly, as we talked about before, this is a publicly subsidized movement, right? All tax-exempt organizations are publicly subsidized, and for them to turn around and say, "Oh, we're being attacked because the mayor says we have to wear masks when we gather to worship." I mean, give me a break. This is the argument is so disingenuous.
Yes.
And even the whole pretext, the whole premise that these people are being victimized in some way. And, you know, again, Weyrich is the one who started this in the 1970s. He was very, 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 very adroit at that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You guys are under attack. The government is telling you what to do, rather than you better get your act together in terms of race, you know, to come up to the times and be in compliance with the laws. It's the whole argument is so disingenuous. And you're right, the long game is a very good way to put it. You know, with Barrett, and I mean, it's and with Trump, and by the way, you can't. You can't understand this movement without understanding that there's a link between the origins of the movement in a defense of racism, the embrace of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Let's remember, Ronald Reagan got into politics in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act in California in 1964, which would allow equal access to housing. He was a vocal opponent of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his career, he kept invoking law and order, which of course is a racially charged term. He used this vile caricature of these mythical welfare queens, women of color. He was never able to produce one of them, but these women of color who were living off the public dole. And to me, the crowning indication was that he opened his general election campaign for president on August 3rd, 1980, in, of all places, Philadelphia, Mississippi, at the Neshoba County Fair. And lest anyone miss his symbolism, and he was a master of symbolism. He told that white crowd that he believed in states' rights, this traditional segregationist battle cry. So you've got to draw the line from the defense of racial segregation to Ronald Reagan, all the way to Donald Trump.
Well, and he played the victim card. And I was there when he did it many times, but here's one that, again, he master of symbolism. He's at the National Religious Broadcasters, and he says to them, "You can't endorse me, dog whistle, because of our stupid tax laws, because you're a nonprofit 501c3 organization or church. You can't endorse me because you're being discriminated against by liberals who won't let you be in politics because you're Christians." End footnote. But I can endorse you. And that was the same dog whistle.
And I'll go further on that one because of that very same speech. And I read through the speech out at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, very same speech. He talks about his support for creationism.
Yep.
He said if he were on a desert island, he wanted a Bible with him. And he went after Jimmy Carter and the Internal Revenue Service for their intervention in Christian schools.
Yeah.
What he didn't say a word about abortion.
Yeah.
In that same speech. And this is, I've read different estimates about the crowd, anywhere from 10 to 20,000 evangelicals at Reunion Arena in Dallas. Didn't mention abortion. This is August 22nd of 1980.
Yeah, and it's still, and we always felt he didn't take a strong enough stand on it. And then finally he would call in something to the January March and this kind of stuff. But obviously, as the guy who had legalized it in California as a libertarian, I mean, he was a far right libertarian, racist, I guess you could say, in the sense that he always took that side. But, of course, only a mild form of things to come by the time you roll the clock forward to Trump. When you follow the curve of the Federalist Society, Heritage, and these other guys funded by people like Coors and the Koch brothers and the others, what was it about people like Joseph Coors, besides their Catholic faith, in terms of an American kind of Ayn Randian view of the economy, libertarianism? There are other threads here that influence these guys. For instance, my supply side Laffer curve, Jack Kemp, who was all about that. He was never about this either. Here's what I don't think people understand. Guys like Jack Kemp, okay, who I knew well. I stayed in his home numerous times with Jack and Joanne. They ran a Schaeffer Bible study. They were never about our issues, ever. They didn't care about them. They always saw this as a stepping stone to getting a few more votes any way you can, whether it's pandering to racists or pandering to pro-lifers. It's all equal to them, as long as at the end of the day, you're winning elections. Right. And so all we ever had to prove was that, like the thing with Brock, this works. And speak to that, because again, the insincerity on the level of the leadership of the Republican Party, even today, they're doing it again, pretending they think that Biden lost the election when they know he won, but you pander to the crowd. They did the same thing with abortion, and they do the same thing with religious liberty, being this kind of speaking to this victimized group of people who, even when they're in the majority and winning, feel sorry for themselves. The level of hypocrisy is huge. And then on the pastor's side, on the side of the Falwells and the Dobsons, the penny dropped for them when they saw this as a fundraising opportunity to just stir the rage pot. We'll save America for $25 donations, or leave us this, or whatever. I mean, speak to some of that cynicism that you've uncovered in your book, Bad Faith, but also your other work.
Well, I think you said it pretty well, Frank. I'm not sure I can say it much better than that. I think you're right. I mean, does anyone really seriously believe that Ronald Reagan was dyed-in-the-wool anti-abortionist? Well, I mean, you can't. I mean, his own record as governor belies that, and certainly his wife wasn't on board when he signed on to the pro-life cause. It's expediency, and I think we're both worldly enough to understand that politicians do that's just the way that things work. But it doesn't detract from the cynicism of it or the shame of it. Right.
I'm going to ask you a big question here in a minute as we cruise on into the end of this interview. But I'm first going to just say this is Randall Balmer we're talking to, author of Bad Faith, Race, and the Rise of the Religious Right. This is a really slim volume, but a very big book in the sense that it's incredibly important. And if you're interested in these issues, or have had any kind of journey out of, to, from evangelical or any other kind of religious background, you have to read this. And please get it. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, a podcast, and can be seen on YouTube and Facebook and many places. I'm going to ask you a tough question. How do you, from your experience of studying all this, see all of this shaking out in the next
cycle. You've taken us from Reagan to Trump,
Yeah.
and you look at the white evangelical movement, footnote, a Hispanic movement that is changing the color of America, but also bringing with them a heavy dose of Pentecostal evangelical fundamentalist faith. Make no mistake, these are not all going to vote Democrat because Republicans are racists.
Right.
So there's a lot going on here, and I know you think about this stuff. Take whatever time you need.
Yeah.
Tell us where you think things are going. Do you have a shred of optimism left for us? How do you see stuff here? And then we'll wrap it up, but take whatever time you need, because I really want to hear what you thought.
Much of what I've been trying to do over the last several decades, Frank, is try to call evangelicals back to their better selves and to say, look, and as you know, that there's a brief section at the beginning of that book where I go into the history of this movement.
Yeah.
And if you look back at this, I'm a historian, so this is what I do, this is my job, this is what I do, but you look back at the history of evangelicals in the 19th century in particular, evangelicals overwhelmingly, now, not always and not perfectly by any stretch of the imagination, but overwhelmingly, they took the side of those on the margins, those people, those Jesus called the least of these. They were involved with prison reform. They were involved in education. They believed in common schools, as they were known in the 19th century, because this was a way to kind of elevate the lower classes so they could become self-sufficient, but also join the middle class. They were engaged in peace crusades. I've even run across an incidence of evangelical gun control in the 19th century. They were advocates for women's equality, even voting rights, which in the 19th century was a radical idea. And you look at the whole picture, the abolition of slavery. I mean, yes, we had Southern evangelicals who were defending slavery. I'm not going to deny that, but evangelicals in the North were trying to end slavery. And it created great divisions in the course of their efforts. So if you look at the overall thrust of evangelical activism in the 19th century and kind of map that onto the current political spectrum, there is no question that evangelicals would lean decidedly to the left of the political spectrum. There's no question about that. Charles Grandison Finney, the most, by any measure, the most influential evangelical of the 19th century, was an ardent foe of capitalism. He said that a Christian businessman is an oxymoron because business elevates avarice over altruism. And those are my words, not his words, but he's very clear in making that argument. He excoriates free market capitalism. And then you take that overall agenda and then you compare it to the religious right, and you have to say, what happened? And in a sense, that's the burden of the book, is trying to explain what happened. So, I mean, getting back to your question about my optimism, I've been trying to call evangelicals back to their better selves, not only to the example and to the precedent of 19th century evangelical activism, but back to the New Testament and Jesus himself. I mean, Jesus was pretty clear about what it takes to get into heaven. And, we can talk about the sinner's prayer and everything else like that, but Matthew 25 is pretty clear about what happens and what needs to transpire to gain entrance into the kingdom of heaven. Am I optimistic? Well, I have to say that the fruits of my efforts so far are not exactly overwhelming. But I also come back to the story in the New Testament when Jesus heals Lazarus from the dead, even though his body had begun to decay. And I have to say, if Jesus can do that, Jesus can save evangelicalism. Now, do I think it's likely? I don't know. I think evangelicals would have to cooperate in some way in that enterprise for it to happen. So, looking into the future, and historians are always reluctant to do that because we're historians, not prognosticators. But I was sure that after 4 years of Donald Trump, isn't one of the things we talked about as children the importance of not bearing false witness, right? And these independent sources have tallied something like 30,000 false or misleading statements over the course of a 4-year presidency. I would think even that would have turned evangelicals against Donald Trump. But if you look at the numbers, and I'm not sure how reliable they are, I think they're probably still combing through those numbers, but the drop off from 2016 was not that great, and evangelicals are still very much in the Trump camp, and that to me is a great source of sadness. And it's even sort of an existential crisis for me. Not that I expect people to care about my existential crises, but this is a movement that profoundly shaped me. It's part of my DNA, and to see this movement tracking off into the far right precincts of the Republican Party it's sad. It's profoundly distressing. And so, what it means is I have to find community with good people like you who understand our common past and share frustrations about the present, and also hopes for the future, even though it doesn't always look terribly hopeful.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to add to that because that's a great place to end. I just want to say that you have been listening to or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and today my friend and my guest, Randall Balmer, who teaches at Dartmouth, who has written this book, Bad Faith, Race, and the Rise of the Religious Right. At the beginning of this program, I read my comment here. Anyone who wants to find the way back from the evangelical Republican suicide pact of the Trump years needs to read this book. And I just hope you take that endorsement seriously, because it was meant seriously. And I think it's sadly true. And I urge you all to buy this book. Randall, I can't thank you enough for this time. It's been really great. Let's not wait 2 more years to have.
That's right. We'll do it.
Talk soon. Okay, bye.